Welcome to the lab. This is the Baked Scientist channel where we explore the why so you know how. Today, we're exploring the why behind soft, delicious, flavorful sandwich bread. So if you want to know how to turn these simple ingredients into this irresistible, fluffy sandwich bread, please stay tuned. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell to stay up to date on all the delicious science. Now let's get into it. So the first thing we're going to do for this sandwich bread recipe is we are going to scald our milk. Now, if you haven't already, please check out our cinnamon roll video, our morning science cinnamon roll video. That will give a good detailed explanation on what exactly scalded milk is and how it works and how it's used in baked goods. But just for a brief overview, we're scalding our milk in order to denature the milk proteins casein and whey. The reason why we're doing this is because whey tends to weaken the gluten structure a little bit, and if we can denature or unwind that protein, then it allows the yeast to be able to work more efficiently when they create their carbon dioxide, and the gluten structure stays intact more so that it can successfully capture that carbon dioxide and create a nice crumb for our sandwich bread, so we have a nice fluffy sandwich bread at the end of the day. So here I am just scalding the milk, and like I said, I'm not going to go into step-by-step details on what to look for when you're scalding the milk. Please go ahead and check out our cinnamon roll video for that. But here you can just see I'm heating the milk on the stove, and since we are scalding it, which is heating it higher than just room temperature warm, we want to make sure that we're cooling this down so that it's still warm, but it's not scalding hot anymore, so we don't kill our yeast when we go to our next step. So now that our milk is finished scalding, I'm going to go ahead and set it to the side so that it can cool, and we're going to move on to our next step. So my milk has cooled, and I've added my warm water to the milk as well. I'm adding it now so you can see warm water and the warm milk. So this is a nice warm environment, and we're going to actually bloom our yeast. So we're going to go ahead and get our yeast activated and start waking up so they can be ready to start working in our dough. And for that, we need a warm, sugary environment. And so here we have our warm water and milk, and I'm adding my sugar to it just to give the yeast a good head start and something to eat while they wake up. So you just want to dissolve your sugar in the milk and water, and then go ahead and add your yeast. Now here's my yeast, and I'm just going to add it in, and you just stir this until it dissolves. And you want to set this aside for about 5 minutes until you see the mixture start to bubble and you see a lot of foam developing. That's when you know your yeast is awake and active, and it's ready to be added to your dough. If you don't see it bubbling and you don't see any kind of foam or anything happening, then your yeast is most likely either dead, it's been expired, or the liquid was too hot, so it killed the yeast. So just start over and then get your yeast woken up so that they can be ready to work for you in that dough. I just want to take a minute here to say, if you guys are really enjoying this content and love understanding the science behind your favorite baked goods and desserts, please go ahead and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you can stay up to date on all the science. We have videos coming out every week, and please, if you're enjoying this, please go ahead and subscribe. So here's my yeast. It was sitting for about 5 minutes, and if you do use scalded milk, I have noticed that the yeast does activate much quicker, and it creates a bigger kind of reaction. As you can see, the foam is very lifted. There's a lot of foam, and it's just really, really loving this environment here. So now we can go ahead and put our flour, and I put the salt in here with the flour, and I'm mixed it up a little bit. So we have our salt and flour here, and on our stand mixer, and I'm just gonna go ahead and add the yeast mixture, and then we're just gonna go ahead and knead this for about 5 to 10 minutes, or just until the dough comes together and it no longer sticks to your finger. Now that our bread mixture is going, our dough is starting to knead, we can go ahead and get into some delicious science. So it's important to know that the main thing for bread, the science behind it, is the gluten. And we've talked about gluten development in a lot of our previous videos. You can check out our English muffin video, as well as our cakes videos and all those other videos. We talk about gluten, but here gluten really is the star. For bread, gluten is really what is making your bread bread. And gluten actually provides bread with structure, and the flour proteins are what are making the gluten. So when flour interacts with water, the flour proteins are able to align their chains, and they form like a network, a matrix that holds in the carbon dioxide that's produced from the yeast. So the yeast, they work to break down the starches that are in the flour, and they break down the starches into sugars. And the way that they break down the starches is by using an enzyme called amylase. And that amylase breaks down the starches to a sugar called maltose, and then further breaks it down to another sugar called glucose. Now, the glucose is what the yeast is actually feeding off of. That's what the yeast uses to actually produce the carbon dioxide. That's its byproduct from eating the glucose, is the carbon dioxide and ethanol. And ethanol, it might sound crazy because you're thinking, oh no, there's ethanol in or there's alcohol in my dough, but this is just a byproduct, and it is cooked off during the baking process. But this is what gives your dough that kind of yeasty smell. It's almost like alcohol-y smell, like when you drink a beer or something. That's kind of the same smell you're getting when you're doing the dough. You're making bread dough, and that's just because it's giving off the same things, the carbon dioxide and ethanol. So the carbon dioxide is what's going to create the bubbles, the little matrix in your sandwich bread. So it's going to give it that nice texture, that nice crumb. And so the more carbon dioxide it can create, the finer, the more elaborate your crumb is going to be. And so the sugars that the yeast doesn't consume, so the yeast isn't going to consume all the sugars that are in your dough. And because of this, it's the sugars that are left over are going to end up going through what's called a Maillard reaction. And we have talked about this reaction in other videos, like our pretzel video and our brown butter video, so please check those out if you haven't already. But the Maillard reaction changes the chemical structure of the sugars, and it creates a browning effect, and it creates more flavors. So Maillard reaction is really a flavor development. So we're creating our flavors in our crust, and we're getting the crust brown. So that's what the leftover sugar is going to be doing. And I'm also adding butter. As you can see, I've been adding butter. You want to add it 1 tablespoon at a time. And it does look crazy because the dough kind of comes apart as you add the butter, but this butter is going to be giving our dough a lot of flavor and a lot of body. So it does give it a little bit more texture when you're adding the butter. So it's something you definitely want to add. You don't want to skip this step. So as I mentioned previously, the butter does add a nice flavor to the dough, and it does make your dough a lot softer, and gives a good structure as well. So the butter is also contributing to the texture and the flavor of your bread product. So please add it. It does give something to the bread. So we're just gonna make sure get all the butter incorporated and the dough is all mixed up before we move on to our next step. So here I'm just testing the dough to see how good of a stretch it has and if it's going to be sticking to my fingers, which it doesn't really stick to my fingers, but I do want it to have a little bit more pull. So I'm going to go ahead and take it off the dough hook and knead it a little bit by hand before we let it rest. So as always, I'm going to grease my work surface, and like I've mentioned in previous videos, I like to use an oil spray, a cooking oil spray, because I don't like to add too much flour. When you add too much flour, your dough can become very dry, and it can change the texture of your dough. So I just like to use an oil spray on my hands and on the work surface. And I will say, when you use scalded milk, your dough will be very, very soft. It is a very soft, very pliable dough, very stretchy. So, and I found that it does rise quicker, and all the reactions do happen a little bit quicker when you do scald your milk. So that's also something to keep in mind if you're going to scald your milk. You can actually this recipe, the bread is produced a lot quicker than if you don't scald your milk, what I've found from my experiments. So here I'm just kneading the dough a little bit and shaping into a ball so that we can go ahead and let it rest for a little bit. I'm just shaping it, and I'm going to get into a ball, and then I'm going to grease my bowl, and we're going to let it rest. So here's my bowl, and I'm just going to spray it down with the same cooking spray, just to give as the dough rises, you don't want it to stick to the side, so you do want to make sure you're greasing whatever bowl you're resting it in. And as I mentioned previously, when you're using scalded milk, the dough does tend to rise a lot quicker. So this first rise we're going to have is going to be about a 45-minute rise versus about 60 to 90 minutes without scalding the milk. And you want to make sure it at least doubles in size. And the reason why we're going through, so we actually have 2 rises for our sandwich bread. And the reason why we're going through 2 rise steps is because when you're making bread, you need to develop enough of the gluten network, or enough of the carbon dioxide, so that your gluten network can really sustain a bread texture. We don't want it flat, and we don't want too large bubble air pockets. So we do want to make sure we're letting it rise twice. And so in preparation for our second rise, I'm going to go ahead and start greasing down my loaf pan, and I'm just using butter. Butter is the best, honestly, for this. You can use cooking spray, but I find the butter really works well. The bread comes right out. So I'm just greasing all nooks and crannies of the baking pan, the loaf pan, so that it's ready for our second rise. So it's been about 45 minutes, and as you can see, like I said, with the scalded milk, 45 minutes was plenty. The dough has definitely doubled in size in that little bit of time. So this also does speed up the recipe's time, which is nice if you're trying to make this bread pretty quickly. But I'm just gonna go ahead and turn it out, and then we're gonna go ahead and do a second rise. And when we do the second rise, we want the bread already shaped in the shape that we're gonna bake it in. So first you want to degas it, get all those large air pockets out. So we want to develop air pockets, but we don't want large air pockets. So we don't want holes in our bread. So we're going to just push it down and smush out all the really big air pockets. And I'm using a rolling pin because I want to make this into kind of a rectangle shape. And make sure you're kind of measuring it to your loaf pan so it's not too long. You want to make sure it fits well into your loaf pan. So I've already measured my loaf pan. I know how wide it is. So I'm just rolling it out to that width, and then we're going to actually roll the dough into like a tube shape. This helps to give it the shape that we're going to want for our loaf, and it also helps to get that network going of the kind of texture we want in our dough, our end product, our loaf. So as you can see, I rolled it up, and you want to make a pretty tight roll So when the yeast continues to create those carbon dioxide bubbles and the gluten starts trapping it, we're getting a smaller bubble formation than huge giant bubbles because we're trying to roll it into a tight roll. And you just want to set it in your loaf pan and cover it. I cover mine with another loaf pan, but you can use a towel or anything that you feel necessary. And then let it rise. And this honestly took about 30 minutes. So it was a much quicker rise than the usual 60 minutes for the second rise. So you wanted this to double in size again, but you do not want to over proof this, because if you overproof it or let it rise too much, it will collapse when it's baking, and you will get large air pockets, and that's not what you want. As you can see, it's doubled in size, it's nice and filled the loaf pan, and it will expand a little bit more as it bakes. So again, this is why you don't want it to proof too much. So we're going to go ahead and bake this at 350 degrees for about 35 to 40 minutes, or until the top is nice and golden brown. And here it is coming out the oven. You can see the top is browned and it's ready to get on the cooling rack. So when you make sandwich bread or any bread at home, you do want to let your bread cool completely because that gluten structure is still, it's warm, so it's the gel part of it is kind of still a little bit more fluid. So you want to make sure it has time to set and become nice and solid, because if you cut it too soon and let all the moisture and everything out, you can negatively affect the texture of your dough or the structure of your dough, or sorry, not your dough, your bread. So please let it cool completely. I know it's very tempting to go ahead and just eat it now, but just let it cool completely. You'll be much more satisfied once your bread is completely cooled and everything has solidified and is intact. So my bread is completely cooled, so let's go ahead and open it up and see what we're dealing with. So I'm just going to cut a slice off, and then we can take a look at the crumb and how it looks. Well, here it is, final result. A nice, delicious, fluffy, homemade loaf of sandwich bread. This bread is perfect for sandwiches, toast, anything you can think of, this bread will be perfect for. So make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Until next time, happy baking!